They fired Caleb Morrow on a Tuesday morning in front of 43 people, and he didn't say a word. He stood there with grease still under his fingernails and a paper cup of cold coffee in his hand. And he listened to Diane Forsyth tell him that his services were no longer required, that punctuality was a non-negotiable standard at Halcyon Precision, and that she had made allowances for him long enough. She said it loud enough that the people on the floor could hear every syllable. She wanted them to. He understood that. It was the kind of firing that was meant to be a lesson for everyone else in the room, and Caleb was just the example. He set the paper cup down on the nearest workbench. He picked up his jacket from the hook by the door. He walked out. He did not tell her that he had been there since 9 o'clock the previous evening. He did not tell her about the phone call he'd gotten from her assistant at 8:47 p.m. The one asking if someone could look at the hydraulic press before the Keller Industries inspection the next morning, because the lead technician had found a hairline fracture in the primary coupling, and nobody else on the crew knew the machine well enough to assess it. He did not tell her that he'd called his neighbor June Ackerman to sit with his daughter Penny while he drove back to the plant in the dark. He did not tell her any of it. He walked to his truck, sat behind the wheel for a minute with his hands in his lap, and then he drove home to get Penny ready for school. Caleb Morrow had worked at Halcyon Precision Manufacturing for 11 years. He'd come on as a floor technician when the plant was still running 3 shifts and the parking lot was full at every hour of the day. He'd worked his way up not because he'd asked for it, but because every time something broke in a way that nobody else could explain, someone eventually ended up at Caleb's bench. He had a way with machines that wasn't mystical. He would have been embarrassed if anyone called it that, but it was real. He understood systems the way some people understood language. He could feel when something was wrong before the sensors caught it. His wife, Carol, had died 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, fast and merciless, the kind that gives you just enough time to understand what's coming before it arrives. Penny had been 5. She was 9 now, and she remembered her mother in fragments. The smell of her shampoo, a yellow cardigan she used to wear on Sundays, the way she hummed while she did dishes. Caleb kept those fragments alive as carefully as he could. He kept a photograph of Carol on the dashboard of his truck. He cooked the same Sunday breakfast she used to make. He tucked Penny in every night, even though she was getting old enough to tell him she didn't need it anymore because Carol had done it, and because some habits are not about need. He had not planned on being the kind of man who was defined by his loss. But grief doesn't ask what you planned. He managed. He was good at managing. He arranged everything with the precision he applied to machines. Penny's school schedule, the carpooling with the Ackermans 2 doors down, the overtime shifts he took on Fridays when June could sit, the ones he turned down on weekday evenings when she couldn't. He had built a life that worked, and it worked because every gear was exactly where it was supposed to be. The problem with a system that precise is that one unexpected variable can bring the whole thing down. The night before he was fired, Caleb had gotten the call at 8:47. He'd recognized the number. It was Forsyth's assistant, a young man named Preston, who always looked slightly overwhelmed by the job. Preston told him what the lead tech had found. He told him the Keller inspection was at 9 the following morning, that Keller Industries was the largest contract Halcyon had ever negotiated, and that if the hydraulic press wasn't certified operational before that inspection, the contract review would be paused and possibly terminated. Caleb asked him if Diane Forsyth knew he was making this call. Preston hesitated for half a second too long and said that Ms. Forsyth was aware the situation needed to be addressed. That wasn't what Caleb had asked, but he let it go. He called June. June said of course, she'd be there in 10 minutes. Bring her the good coffee next time you go to the store. He kissed Penny on the top of her head. She was already asleep. One arm around the stuffed rabbit Carol had given her the Christmas before she got sick, and he drove back to the plant. The fracture in the primary coupling was worse than Preston had described. Not catastrophic, not yet, but the kind of thing that would have failed under sustained load. Caleb stripped the coupling, inspected the secondary housing, found a stress pattern that suggested the fracture had been developing for at least 3 weeks, and replaced both components from the parts inventory. He calibrated the press. He ran it through 4 test cycles. He documented everything in the system: part numbers, timestamps, calibration readings, his employee ID, and submitted the service report through the internal maintenance portal at 5:58 in the morning. He drove home at 6:14. He showered. He made Penny breakfast. He called June to ask if she could take Penny to school because he needed to go back in, and June said yes, but you look like death warmed over, Caleb. And he said, I know, but it'll be fine. He got to the plant at 8:11 a.m. Diane Forsyth was already in the building. The Keller team had arrived early. The inspection of the hydraulic press had been completed at 7:45, and the press had been certified operational, and the Keller contract, the largest in the company's history, had been formally advanced to the next phase. Caleb walked in at 8:11. He was supposed to be there at 7:30. Diane Forsyth fired him at 8:14. The thing about Diane Forsyth was that she wasn't a cruel person. That was what made it complicated. She was efficient, and she believed in standards, and she had built Halcyon's reputation on the premise that every process in the building had to meet the same bar regardless of circumstance. She had said it in every quarterly address for 6 years. She believed it. When Caleb walked in 41 minutes late on the morning of the most important inspection the company had ever hosted, she did not stop to ask why. She had made the policy, she had communicated the policy, and she intended to enforce it. What she did not know, what nobody had told her, as far as she was aware, was that the inspection had gone smoothly because of work done the night before by the man she was firing in front of 43 people. What she also did not know, though she would learn it later, was that the service report Caleb had filed at 5:58 in the morning was no longer in the system. Caleb found out about the report 3 days later. He had gone back to retrieve the documentation. Not for any legal reason, not yet, just because he was organized and he liked to have his records, and because May June had suggested gently that it might be worth holding on to. He logged into the portal with his credentials, which hadn't been deactivated yet, and searched for the service entry from Tuesday morning. It wasn't there. He searched by date. He searched by equipment ID. He searched by his employee number. Nothing. The entry he had filed at 5:58 a.m. The one with the part numbers and the calibration readings and 4 test cycle results had been removed. He sat at his kitchen table for a long time with his laptop open and the cursor blinking. Penny came in from the backyard with a handful of dandelions she'd picked from the edge of the fence and put them in a glass of water on the counter without saying anything, the way she did when she knew he was thinking hard about something. She was 9 years old, and she already knew when not to ask questions. Caleb looked at the dandelions in the glass and felt something tighten in his chest that wasn't grief and wasn't anger, but was somewhere in the territory between them. He thought about who had access to the maintenance portal. He thought about who would have had reason to remove the entry. He thought about Preston's half-second hesitation on the phone when Caleb had asked if Forsyth knew about the call. He thought about a man named Douglas Hecht. Douglas Hecht was the plant operations manager. He had been at Halcyon for 3 years, brought in from outside, and from his first week he had been in visible competition with the idea of Caleb Morrow. Not with Caleb personally. Hecht was too careful for personal antagonism, but with the fact of him. Caleb was the person people called when something was wrong. He was the institutional knowledge, the one who'd been there long enough to know why the secondary press on line 4 ran hot in the summer, and why you had to let the CNC mill warm up for 15 minutes before tolerances could be trusted. Hecht had spent 3 years trying to systematize that knowledge, to put it into manuals and checklists, and the reason it hadn't worked was that Caleb was still there and easier to call. Hecht had administrator access to the maintenance portal. Hecht had been in the building when Caleb arrived on Tuesday morning. Caleb had seen his car in the lot, and Hecht, Caleb recalled now with a clarity that felt like cold water, had been the one who originally scheduled the lead technician for the coupling inspection, the one who had reportedly found the fracture. The same lead technician who had not been the one to call Caleb. Preston had called Caleb. Caleb pulled up his phone and found the call log. 8:47 p.m., 14-minute conversation. It was there. He took a photograph of the screen. He didn't go back to Halcyon. He thought about it. He drafted a letter twice and deleted it both times, but he wasn't sure what he was asking for or who he was asking. Forsyth had made her decision in public, and publicly committed people rarely reverse course, without a reason that makes reversal feel like strength rather than admission. He needed someone on the inside. The person he thought of was a woman named Ruth Calloway, who ran quality assurance and had worked with Caleb for 8 years and was one of the few people at Halcyon who said what she meant regardless of who was in the room. She had watched the firing from across the floor. Caleb had seen her face in the moment. Not the politely blank expression most people had worn, but something tighter, something that looked like it was being held in. He sent her a message through a personal channel, nothing detailed, just asking if she had a few minutes. She called him back within the hour. She didn't wait for him to finish his first sentence. "I've been looking into it," she said. "The night entry. It's gone, I know. That's not a glitch, Caleb. I've been doing QA here for 8 years. Entries don't vanish. They can be archived, they can be flagged, they can be marked superseded. They don't disappear. Disappear? Who has deletion access?" There was a pause. 2 people, Hecht and Forsyth herself. Caleb was quiet. "There's something else," Ruth said. "The parts you pulled, the coupling, the secondary housing, they were logged back into inventory the next morning under a different work order. Someone reassigned them. Made it look like routine maintenance on line 2? No, that's not where they went. No, but it's where the record says they went." He sat with that for a moment. "Ruth, the coupling had a fracture pattern that was at least 3 weeks old. You can still see it on the part itself if the part is somewhere in inventory. I know, if someone pulls it, I already flagged it for inspection hold," she said. "I have standing to do that. I told my supervisor it was a quality concern flag during my own audit, which is true. I did flag it. During my own audit. This morning." Caleb leaned back in his chair. "You were already doing this before I called. I watched them fire you in front of the whole floor," she said, "for being 40 minutes late after spending the night fixing a machine that saved a $40 million contract. I wasn't going to just go back to my desk." The part was in the secondary inventory cage, mislabeled as a returned component from line 2. Ruth photographed the fracture pattern and the stamped serial number, which matched the equipment record Caleb had documented before submitting his now deleted report. The fracture pattern was consistent with the progressive stress he had identified, meaning it had been developing for weeks before he addressed it, meaning the press would have failed under the load of the inspection if he hadn't replaced it. Ruth brought the photographs to the plant's internal safety officer first, because that was procedure, and she believed in procedure even when it was inconvenient. The safety officer, a careful man named Bert Okafor, who had been at Halcyon almost as long as Caleb, reviewed the documentation and asked Ruth 3 questions. Then he asked her to give him 24 hours. What Bert did in those 24 hours was file a formal equipment integrity inquiry, which required by the plant's own safety protocols that any inquiry into a maintenance discrepancy be reviewed by an independent party. In this case, that meant Halcyon's insurance carrier's engineering liaison, who had standing authority to review maintenance records going back 18 months. The engineering liaison pulled the portal logs, not the entries themselves, but the access and modification metadata, which existed on a separate server and was not subject to the same administrator-level deletion permissions. The metadata showed that a maintenance entry had been created at 5:58 a.m. on Tuesday under Caleb Morrow's employee ID, and that the entry had been deleted at 7:12 a.m. by an account with administrator access. The access log identified the account. It was Douglas Hecht's. Caleb found out on a Friday afternoon when Ruth called him. Penny was in the backyard again, doing homework at the picnic table because she liked being outside when the weather was good, and Caleb was watching her through the kitchen window with a second cup of coffee that had gone cold. Ruth told him what the metadata showed. She told him about Hecht's account. She told him that the engineering liaison had escalated to Halcyon's board of directors and that the board had immediately retained outside counsel. "What does that mean for the contract?" Caleb asked. "The Keller contract is fine. The inspection results stand. The work was real, Caleb. The machine passed because you fixed it." He nodded, though she couldn't see him. "Hecht's position has been suspended pending investigation," Ruth said. "And there's something else. Forsyth called me this morning." Caleb waited. "She asked for your number. You didn't give it to her." "I told her I'd pass along that she was looking for you. I figured you should decide." He thought about standing in front of 43 people with cold coffee in his hand. He thought about Penny asleep with her rabbit, the way she'd looked when he'd kissed her head in the dark before driving back to the plant. He thought about 5:58 in the morning and the cursor blinking in an empty search field. "Tell her she can call," he said. Diane Forsyth called the following Monday. She didn't open with an apology, which was not what Caleb had expected, and turned out to be exactly right. She opened with a statement of fact. She said that she had been presented with documentation establishing that he had performed emergency maintenance on the hydraulic press the night before the Keller inspection, that his service record had been deleted by Douglas Hecht following the completion of that maintenance, and that she had terminated his employment without the information she would have needed to make an informed decision. Then she said, "I made the wrong call." Caleb said, "Yes, I want to ask you to come back," she said, "with a corrected record. Retroactive pay for the period you were out, and a formal acknowledgement in writing of what you did that night." He thought about it for a moment that stretched out long enough that she didn't try to fill it. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Go ahead. When Preston called me that evening, did you know he was calling?" There was a silence on her end that told him the answer before she said it. "No," she said. "I knew the press had a reported issue. I was told it was being handled through normal channels." "Hecht told you that?" "Yes." Caleb understood then the full shape of it. Hecht had sent Preston to call Caleb. Not through official channels, not with Forsyth's knowledge, because keeping Forsyth uninformed meant that when the inspection went through smoothly, Hecht could take credit for the decision to address it. And if Caleb showed up late the next morning, exhausted, without his babysitter, scrambling to get his daughter to school, and got fired for it, there was no one to contradict the story. There was no overnight record. There was just a problem that had resolved itself, and Hecht standing in the right place. It was not a complicated scheme, but it didn't need to be complicated. It only needed one person not to ask the right questions at the right time. "I'll come back," Caleb said, "on one condition." "What's that?" "The acknowledgement you mentioned. The written one. I want it posted on the floor, in the same place where you told me I was fired." There was another silence. He could hear her considering it. "All right," she said. "And I want the morning of the 14th marked in the maintenance record as the date the press was serviced," he said. "Not retroactively corrected, actually marked, with my name on it." "Done." He looked out the window. Penny had come inside while he was on the call and was sitting at the kitchen table doing something with colored pencils. She had her mother's way of concentrating, that same particular stillness, the slight tilt of the head. "Monday," he said. "I'll be there at 7:30. He went back on a Monday. Ruth met him in the parking lot, which he hadn't expected and which was exactly the kind of thing Ruth would do. She fell into step beside him without saying anything, the way old colleagues do, the way people do when the point is presence and not commentary. The letter was posted on the wall by the time clock. It was typed on company letterhead, and it said, plainly and without embellishment, that Caleb Morrow had performed emergency maintenance on the hydraulic press on the night of the 13th, that the Keller inspection had been made possible by that work, that his employment record had been falsified without his knowledge, and that his termination had been a mistake. It was signed by Diane Forsyth. Caleb stood there and read it once. The floor was already running. The hum of the machines, the low conversation of the morning crew, the smell of metal and oil that he had been breathing for 11 years. Nobody made a point of watching him read it, but nobody looked away either. He clocked in at 7:28. 3 weeks later, Douglas Hecht resigned in advance of a termination hearing. The metadata evidence from the portal logs was referred to the county DA's office on the question of whether the deletion of a safety-related maintenance record constituted criminal falsification. Caleb wasn't party to that process. He gave a statement when asked, gave it clearly and completely, and went back to work. Ruth asked him once, after all of it had settled, what the worst part had been. He thought about it honestly. Not the firing itself, he said. Not the public part of it, even though that had been its own particular kind of ugly. The worst part had been the drive home that morning. The 40 minutes between walking out of Halcyon and walking through his front door, when he had no idea why any of it had happened, when it was possible, still possible, in that window, that he had simply miscalculated somehow, that the system had worked exactly as designed and he was just on the wrong side of it. I kept thinking about the report, he said. I knew I'd filed it. I knew the time. I knew the part numbers. I knew every step. And I thought, what if none of that matters? What if you can do everything right and it just doesn't count? Ruth didn't say anything for a moment. But it did count, she said. It did, he agreed. Eventually, that qualifier sat between them, and neither of them tried to dress it up. Penny drew a picture of the hydraulic press that winter. She'd asked him to describe it to her. What it looked like, how it worked, what it sounded like when it was running right. And she'd sat at the kitchen table, with her colored pencils for the better part of an hour, constructing her version of it in careful, deliberate marks. It didn't look much like the actual machine. It looked like something from a children's book, blocky and solid, with exaggerated valves and a little window she had invented that didn't exist on the real one. She slid it across the table to him when she was done and said, without looking up from the table, "Is that sort of what it's like?" He looked at it for a long moment. The little invented window. The careful lines. "Yeah," he said, "that's sort of what it's like." She nodded, satisfied, and went to put the pencils away. He pinned the drawing above his workbench at the plant, next to the maintenance log for line 3. It stayed there. People noticed it and didn't say much about it because some things in a workplace earn their place quietly, over time, without anyone needing to explain them. The machine ran clean. It had run clean since the night he'd fixed it, and it kept running clean, and that was now part of the story that nobody posted on a wall or referred to a DA or wrote on company letterhead. But it was the part that was always true.